The 7.62A, 51mm NATO is a rimless bottlenecked rifle cartridge developed in the 1950s as a standard for small arms among NATO countries. It should not be confused with the similarly named Russian 7.62A, 54mm cartridge, a slightly longer-rimmed cartridge. It was introduced in U.S. service in the M14 rifle and M16 machine gun in the late 1950s. The M14 was superseded in U.S. service as the infantry adopted the 5.56A, 45mm NATO M16. However, the M14 and many other firearms that use the 7.62A, 51 round remain in service, especially in the case of sniper rifles, machine guns, and as the service weapon chosen by Special Operations Forces. The cartridge is used both by infantry and on mounted and crew-served weapons mounted to vehicles, aircraft and ships. Although not identical, the 7.62A, 51mm NATO and the commercial .308 Winchester cartridges are similar enough that they can be loaded into rifles chambered for the other round, but the Winchester .308 cartridges are typically loaded to higher pressures than 7.62x 51mm NATO cartridges for use in long-distance hunting of big game animals. Even though the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute does not consider it unsafe to fire the commercial round in weapons chambered for the NATO round, there is significant discussion about compatible chamber and muzzle pressures between the two cartridges based on powder loads and wall thicknesses on the military versus commercial rounds. While the debate goes both ways, the ATF recommends checking the stamping on the barrel. If you're unsure, consult the maker of the firearm. Overview: the cartridge itself offers similar ballistic performance in most firearms to the .30-06 Springfield that it replaced in U.S. service. Though shorter, standard loadings fire similar bullet weights with only a slight reduction in velocity. Modern propellants allowed for similar performance from a case with less capacity. The smaller case requires less brass and yields a shorter cartridge. This shorter cartridge allows a slight reduction in the size and weight of firearms that chamber it, and somewhat better cycling in automatic and semi-automatic rifles. Development: work that would eventually develop the 7.62A, 51mm NATO started just after World War I when the large, powerful .30-06 cartridge proved difficult to adapt to semi-automatic rifles. A less powerful cartridge would allow a lighter firing mechanism. At the time the most promising design was the .276 Pedersen. When it was eventually demonstrated that the .30-06 was suitable for semi-automatic rifles, the .276 was dropped. Thus when war appeared to be looming again only a few decades later, the .30-06 was the only round available and the M1 Garand provided U.S. troops with greater firepower than their bolt-action armed opponents. The Garand performed so well that the U.S. saw little need to replace it during World War II, and the .30-06 served well beyond the Korean War and into the mid-1960s. During the 1940s and early 1950s several experiments were carried out to improve the Garand. One of the most common complaints was the limited capacity 8-round end-block clip, and many experimental designs modified the weapon with a detachable box magazine. Springfield Armory's T-20 rifle was a fully automatic version. Though not adopted, experience with a fully automatic Garand laid the groundwork for its replacement. The test program continued for several years, including both the original .30-06 round and a modified .300 Savage. In the end, the T-65 cartridge demonstrated power roughly equal to the original .30-06, firing a 147-grain bullet at 2,750 feet per second, but was approximately 1 or 2 inch shorter. The eventual result of this competition was the T-44 rifle. When the United States developed the T-65 cartridge, the British military took a different route. They had spent considerable time and effort developing the intermediate power .280 British cartridge with an eye towards controllable fully automatic fire. The U.S. held to its desire not to reduce the effectiveness of individual aimed shots. The American philosophy was to use automatic fire for emergencies only and continue to use semi-automatic fire the majority of the time. After considerable debate, the Canadian Army announced they would be happy to use the .280 but only if the U.S. did as well. It was clear the U.S. was not going to use the .280. The British did start introducing the .280 along with the bullpup rifle No. 9, but the process was stopped in the interests of harmonization across NATO. The T65E5, 7.62 x 51 mm was chosen as the NATO standard cartridge in 1954. Winchester Ammunition saw the market for a civilian model of the T65 cartridge and released it commercially in 1952 as the .308 Winchester, 2 years prior to adoption of the cartridge by NATO. The T44 was adopted as the M14 in 1957. Around the same time Britain and Canada adopted the Belgian FNFAL as the L1 followed by West German Army as the G1. The Germans soon transitioned to a modified version of the Spanish CETME rifle by Heckler and Koch that was adopted as the G3. With all three of these firearms, it was clear that the 7.62 NATO could not be fired controllably in fully automatic because of recoil. Both the M14S and FAL would later go through several variations intended to either limit fully automatic selection through semi-auto version or selector locks or to improve control with bipods or heavier barrels. While this was going on, the U.S. Project Salvo concluded that a burst of 4 rounds into a 20-inch circle would cause twice the number of casualties as a fully automatic burst by one of these rifles, regardless of the size of the round. They suggested using a much smaller .22 caliber cartridge with 2 bullets per cartridge, while other researchers investigated the promising flechette rounds that were lighter but offered better penetration than even the .30-06. These studies were kept secret to prevent the British from using them as evidence in favor of their smaller rounds. When the M14 arrived in Vietnam, it was found to have a few disadvantages. The rifle's overall length was not well suited for jungle warfare. Also, the weight of 7.62 51 mm cartridges limited the total amount of ammunition that could be carried in comparison with the 7.62 39 mm cartridge of the Type 56 and AK-47 assault rifles, which the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers were equipped with. In addition, the originally issued wooden-stocked versions of the M14 were susceptible to warping from moisture in tropical environments, producing wandering zeros, and other accuracy problems, which caused the adoption of fiberglass stocks. Fighting between the big round and small round groups reached a peak in the early 1960s, when test after test showed the .223 Remington cartridge fired from the AR-15 allowed an 8-soldier unit to outgun an 11-soldier unit armed with M14s. U.S. troops were able to carry more than twice as much 5.56 45 mm ammunition as 7.62 51 mm for the same weight, which allowed them an advantage against a typical NVA unit armed with Type 56-1s. AK-47 magazines are much heavier than M14 and M16 magazines. In 1964, the U.S. Army started replacing their M14s with the M16, incurring another series of complaints from the British. Regardless of the M14 having disadvantages in jungle warfare, 7.62 51 mm NATO rifles stayed in military service around the world due to several factors. The 7.62 51 mm NATO has proved much more effective than 5.56 45 mm at long ranges, and has since found popularity as a sniping round. For instance, M14 variants such as the Mk14 Enhanced Battle Rifle and M25 Sniper Rifle were utilized in the United States military as designated marksman and sniper rifles. Shorter, easier to handle 7.62 mm rifles like the Heckler and Koch G3 stayed in service due to their accuracy, range, cartridge effectiveness and reliability. Specialized loadings were created for 7.62 51 mm NATO chambered sniper rifles. They used heavier and more streamlined bullets that had a higher ballistic coefficient than standard ball rounds, meaning they shed velocity at longer ranges more gradually. Loss of velocity is important for accurate long-range shots because dropping from supersonic to transonic speeds disturbs the flight of the bullet and adversely affects accuracy. The standard M80 ball round weighs 147 grains and has a muzzle velocity 200 foot per second faster than the M118LR 175 grains sniping round. However, the M80 drops to subsonic velocity around 875 am, while the initially slower M118LR is supersonic out to 950 am due to its low-drag bullet. The 7.62A, 51mm NATO round nevertheless met the designer's demands for fully automatic reliability with a full-power round. It remained the main machine gun round for almost all NATO forces well into the 1990s, even being used in adapted versions of older .30-06 machine guns such as the Browning M1919A4 from the WWII era. These have been replaced to a considerable extent in the light machine gun role by 5.56A, 45mm NATO weapons, such as the widespread use of the M249 SAW, but the 7.62 round is still the standard chambering for most general-purpose machine guns such as the M60E4, the M240 and the German HK21 and MG3, and flexible mounting such as helicopters, jeeps, and tanks. The U.S. Army is developing an improved version of the M80 ball 7.62 on round, called the M80A1. The M80A1 incorporates changes found in the M855A1 5.56 on round. Like the M855A1, the M80A1 is expected to have better hard target penetration, more consistent performance against soft targets, and significantly increased distances of these effects over the M80. The bullet is redesigned with a copper jacket and exposed hardened steel penetrator, eliminating 114.5 grains of lead with production of each M80A1 projectile. Fielding is expected for 2014. Military cartridge types. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, ball, M59, 150.5 grain 7.62A. 51mm NATO ball cartridge. A further development of the initial T65 cartridge. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, high-pressure test, M60, 7.62A, 51mm NATO test cartridge. The cartridge is not for field issue, but is used for proof firing of weapons during manufacture, test, or repair. The cartridge is identified by a Stanek stained case. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, armor-piercing, M61, 150.5 grain 7.62A, 51mm NATO armor-piercing round, black cartridge tip. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, Tracer, M62, 142 grain tracer cartridge, orange cartridge tip. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, dummy, M63. The cartridge is used for practice in loading 7.62mm weapons for simulated firing to detect flinching of personnel during firing and for inspecting and testing the weapon mechanism. The cartridge is identified by 6 longitudinal corrugations on the cartridge case. There is no primer and no vent hole in the primer pocket. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, grenade, M64, 7.62A, 51mm NATO grenade launching blank. The cartridge is identified by a rose petal closure of the cartridge case mouth and sealed with red lacquer. The cartridge provides pressure upon functioning to project rifle grenade to a desired target when using a grenade projectile adapter and Dragon missile launch effect trainer. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, ball, M80, 147 grain 7.62A, 51mm NATO ball cartridge. The U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory measured a ballistic coefficient of 0.200 and form factor of 1.105 for the M80 ball projectile. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, ball, M80A1, M80 lead-free 7.62A, 51 mm NATO ball cartridge. 114.5 grain of lead eliminated per M80A1 projectile. To be issued in 2014. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, blank, M82, 7.62A. 51 mm NATO cartridge is used in rifles and machine guns equipped with blank firing attachments to simulate firing in training exercises and for saluting purposes. The cartridge is identified by its double-tapered neck and absence of a bullet. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, ball, silent, XM115. Little is known of this round, but it was an attempt to quiet the round. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, match, M118, 173 grain 7.62A, 51 mm NATO full metal jacket boat tail round specifically designed for match purposes. The round was introduced as the XM118 match in 1963 and was produced at both Frankfurt Arsenal and Lake City Army Ammunition Plant. It was standardized as M118 match in mid-1965. It used the same bullet as the .30-06 Springfield M72 match ball round, match-grade brass cartridges, and used fitted number 43 primers. Production ceased at Frankfurt in 1965 but continued at Lake City until the early 1980s. Lake City used dedicated equipment to produce the ammo up until the mid-1970s, and during that time the quality of the ammunition was quite good. When they ceased using dedicated machinery, the quality of the ammo had a very noticeable decline. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, ball, special, M118, 173 grain 7.62A. 51 mm NATO full metal jacket boat tail round specifically designed for match purposes. Produced by Lake City Army Ammunition Plant. This is an interim match round which utilized standard M80 ball brass cartridges with a 173 grain full metal jacketed ball boat-tailed bullet and staked number 34 or number 36 primers. During this period in the early to late 1980s, the performance of the round declined. Powder, primer, and brass were the same as standard ball rounds. Bullets and powder charges varied in weight due to worn machinery and poor quality control. Since it couldn't be called match due to its erratic trajectory, it was renamed special ball. Snipers used to test shoot batches of ammo, find a batch that shot well, then zeroed their weapon to that batch and tried to procure as much of that ammo as possible. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, ball, special, M118LR, 175 grain 7.62A, 51 mm NATO match-grade round specifically designed for long-range sniping. It uses a 175 grain Sierra Match King hollow point boat-tail bullet. Produced at Lake City Army Ammunition Plant. The propellant's noticeable muzzle flash and temperature sensitivity led to the development of the Mk316 MOD-0 for special operations use. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, frangible, M160, 108.5 grain 7.62A, 51 mm NATO frangible bullet, upon striking a target, disintegrates, leaving a mark at the point of impact. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, dummy, M172, 7.62A, 51 mm NATO cartridge is inert and is used to test the mechanism and metallic link belts of 7.62 mm weapons. The cartridge is identified by a black oxide finish over the entire round and has no primer. There is no vent hole in the primer pocket. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, ball, overhead fire, XM178, 7.62A, 51 mm NATO overhead fire application cartridge using a solid, turned, GM bullet. These were developed to supposedly make the OFA cartridges safer since there would be no small pieces of bullet that could separate and fall on the troops. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, Treza, overhead fire, XM179, 7.62A, 51mm NATO overhead fire application cartridge using a solid, turned, GM bullet. These were developed to supposedly make the OFA cartridges safer since there would be no small pieces of bullet that could separate and fall on the troops. XM179/XM180 difference is the amount of trace mixture. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, Treza, overhead fire, XM180, 7.62A, 51mm NATO overhead fire application cartridge using a solid, turned, GM bullet. These were developed to supposedly make the OFA cartridges safer since there would be no small pieces of bullet that could separate and fall on the troops. XM179/XM180 difference is the amount of trace mixture. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, blank, XM192, 7.62A, 51mm short case rose crimp dummy. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, duplex, M198, 7.62A, 51mm NATO duplex round with 284 grain bullets. The developmental designation was T314E3. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, ball, low recoil, XM256, 7.62A, 51mm NATO single 82 grain bullet from M198 round. Another attempt to control the M14 in full auto mode or for small stature troops. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, Treza, M276, 7.62A, 51mm NATO so-called dim tracer with reduced effect primarily for use with night vision devices, green cartridge tip with pink ring. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, match, M852, 168 grain 7.62A, 51mm NATO hollow point boat tail cartridge, specifically designed for use in national match competitions. It was dubbed Mexican Match, because it was based on the international match loading used at the Pan Am Games in Mexico. It used standard brass, primer, and propellant, but used a match-grade bullet. It was later approved by U.S. Army JAG in the 1990s for combat use by snipers. It replaced the M118SB as the standard match round. The bullet was very accurate at around 300 meters but suffered at longer ranges. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, Saboted Light Armor Penetrator, M948, 7.62A, 51mm NATO Saboted Light Armor Penetrator cartridge. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, Saboted Light Armor Penetrator Treza, M959, 7.62A, 51mm NATO Saboted Light Armor Penetrator cartridge with tracer element. Never adopted. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, ball, training, M973, 7.62A, 51mm NATO SATA ball training round. Has air brake to reduce the range the bullet will fly. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, Treza, training, M974, 7.62A, 51mm NATO SATA tracer training round. Has air brake to reduce the range the bullet will fly. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, armor piercing, M993, 126.6 grains 7.62A, 51mm NATO armor piercing round, black cartridge tip. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm special ball, long range, MK316 MOD-0, a 175 grain round specifically designed for long-range sniping consisting of Sierra Match King hollow point boat tail projectiles, Federal Cartridge Company match cartridge cases and gold medal match primers. The propellant has been verified as IMR4064. Cartridge, caliber 7.62mm, NATO, ball, barrier, T762 TNB1 Mk319 MOD0, 7.62A, 51 mm NATO Enhance Behind Barrier Performance Enhance Function and Casualty and Muzzle Flash Requirements in Short Barrel Carbines, 130 grains. Cartridge, Grenade, L1A1, 7.62A, 51 mm Grenade Launching Cartridge with one subvariant. Cartridge, Ball, L2A1, 7.62A, 51 mm Ball Cartridge, with three subvariants. Cartridge, Treza, L5A1, 7.62A, 51 mm Treza Cartridge, designed to last out to 1,000 meters. Four subvariants exist, with brighter ignition, Treza reduced to 750 meters, with a pistol powder charge, and with improved ballistics. Cartridge, Ball, L42A1, 7.62A, 51 mm Ball Cartridge, 155 grain round. Cartridge, Ball, L44A1, 7.62A, 51 mm Ball Cartridge, 144 grain round. Cartridge, caliber 7.62 mm, NATO, Ball, F4, 144 grain 7.62A, 51 mm NATO Ball Cartridge. Australian equivalent to US M80 round. In service with the Australian Defence Force. Patron AB22, 7.62 mm A, 51, DM41, Wachkin, 7.62A, 51 mm NATO Ball Cartridge. Burden primed, copper-washed steel jacket. German equivalent to US 7.62A, 51 mm M80 round. Standard service round for the G3 battle rifle. Patron AB22, 7.62 mm A, 51, DM111, Wachkin, 147 grain 7.62A, 51 mm NATO Ball Cartridge, cupronickel coated steel jacket. German equivalent to US M80 round. In service with the German military. Known for severe fragmentation in human tissue due to its thin jacket, particularly around the cannula. Patron, 7.62 mm A, 51, DM111A1, further development of the DM111. Retained green primer in place of lead acid primer and lead core capped with closure disc. Instead of steel jacket with gilding metal plating, the DM111A1 has a gilding metal jacket. Fragments in soft tissue, sometimes including the closure disc separating from the projectile base. Patron AM31, 7.62 mm A, 51, DM28A2, Mana Paragrapher, blanks, olive-colored plastic with a brass base. Patron AM32, 7.62 mm A, 51, DM18A1B1, Aubong, 10 grain 7.62A, 51 mm NATO plastic training cartridge, plastic case cartridge colored light blue with an extraordinary light 10 grain plastic bullet which is fired with a high initial velocity. Extremely accurate, non-corrosive, steel base with lead-free primer. Non-reloadable ammunition. Department of Defense Identification Codes. This U.S. Armed Forces and NATO code is used to identify the cartridge type, and the packing method used. A111, 100 round M13 linked belt. A165 750 round M13 linked belt. Used in 7.62 miniguns. AA11, long-range ball 20 round carton. Used in precision match, designated marksman, and sniper rifles. See also, 7.62 caliber, .276 Pedersen, caliber conversion sleeve, NATO EPVAT testing, STANAG, list of rifle cartridges, table of handgun and rifle cartridges, references. External links, various photos of 7.62A, 51 NATO ammunition.